Sometimes in life, you need to expect the unexpected. Like a chat with the man who literally wrote the book on Jesus' resurrection.
Good to meet you, Paulogia.
Good to meet you.
You had to have heard of him. I'm sure everybody hears of everybody.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
He's become a legend in the world of atheists.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And every once in a while, those claims are about me. Regular viewers of my channel will know that examining the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is a central topic around here. So when the organizers of what they claim will be the ultimate Jesus resurrection debate, featuring two world-famous historians, Christian Dr Mike Licona versus agnostic Dr BART, in a 7-hour, no-holds-barred comprehensive battle, which you can pre-order early bird access to now at the link on screen for the absolute perfect Easter gift for the believer or non-believer in your life, wanted to get word out. Naturally, they reached out to me and said that Dr. Licona himself is so excited and enthusiastic over the event that he's willing to spare a few minutes of his time to come talk to you on your channel.
15 to 20 minutes?
Yeah, so I'll set my timer. That of a known apostate and resurrection naysayer. How could I possibly say no? But on what topic should I use this precious time? For those in my audience who want me to debate you right at this moment, this is not the time or place for that to happen. Maybe one day, we'll see. On one hand, Dr. Mike Licona is one of my favorite go-to Christian sources to demonstrate the weaknesses in less scholarly Christian arguments. People who are familiar with my channel have seen your face a lot because you are my favorite Christian historian, I suppose is the right word, to come on and agree with me a lot because you have such... Mike had some very important things that I think it's important for Christians and non-Christians alike to hear. I disagree with Mike Licona on a great many things, but at least he's being honest and open about what he observes. But I'll let resurrection-affirming New Testament scholar Mike Licona explain. That's why sophisticated scholars like Dr. Licona, here's Christian historian and resurrection apologist Dr. Mike Licona, with the more scholarly view among professional believers.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
That's what I said.
Well, thanks, Paulogia. I appreciate that very much, and I believe it's genuine, and it's very good to be with you on the show.
Appreciate it. So maybe I should use the time to try to rack up some gotcha sound bites for future Christian refutations. But then again, there's a few times where Professor Licona has directly addressed resurrection content of mine. Should we talk about that? I just want to kind of get your thoughts about a few things where we've brushed up against each other a little bit in different times in the past, if that's all right with you.
Sure.
Sadly, with the clock running quickly and the friendly promotional nature of the occasion, I didn't feel I could push back too much on every detail I wanted to. I may elucidate a little here, with acknowledgement and your awareness that Dr. Licona doesn't have a chance, at least today, to counter my additions. First up, the time when Mike and Gary Habermas critiqued a call I took on the atheist experience about martyred apostles.
So I'm gonna start this video and let me know when you guys want to stop, and we'll go at it like that. All right?
There is good evidence for only 2 of the 12, Peter and James, son of Zebedee. Those are the only 2 that we can have any level of confidence.
We do have some evidence. Some of it is late. And so when we talk about, we can be certain of some. I think for Paul, Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus, I think Sean has a couple of more than that. I was the external reader for his doctoral dissertation. He did an excellent job. We have some evidence for some of the others. It's just not as good as it is.
Well, I think we basically landed in the same place, that the really good evidence for apostle martyrs would be for Paul and Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. And I think that we both kind of agreed in general that the best evidence is for those 3, and the evidence for everyone else is at least somewhat lower.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
So for me, as a historian, I would say for Paul, Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus, yeah, we can be certain that they died as martyrs. The rest of them, I think what's important is to say that we've got enough evidence to be sure that they were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs. And that's important because you don't die necessarily for something you believe is false.
My follow-up question there was, if the traditions for their death isn't necessarily great well enough to tell us that they died, where do you get the traditions that you think are strong that they actually went and preached? It seems to me like after Acts 4 or so, kind of the 10 disappear from reliable history. What do you go with to say that they actually did put their lives on the line?
Well, we've got nearly a dozen sources that talk about this. So you have Luke, who mentions, the sufferings of Peter and Paul, and the martyrdom of James, the half brother of Jesus, or brother of John, the son of Zebedee.
Right. Though I'm thinking specifically about the other 10, like the 10.
Sure. That's starting off with that.
Cool.
Then you've got John, of course, that mentions the death of Peter.
So still Peter.
So that'd be 2 in the New Testament. You have Tertullian, about the beginning of the 3rd century, late 2nd century, who mentions the sufferings of the apostles.
It's late, but in Prescriptions Against Heretics, Tertullian does mention Paul, Peter, and John, not the others.
Let's see. You've got Paul, who mentions his own sufferings. Of course, that's New Testament, but there you got some there. You've got Dionysius of Corinth, latter part of the 2nd century, mid to later part of the 2nd century.
Dionysius mentions only Peter and Paul by name.
Origen, who's probably the first quarter or so of the 3rd century.
Origen does add a new name to the list, Andrew. So I'll forgive the very late source for now.
Polycarp, who is probably the early part of the 2nd century. First third of the 2nd century.
Just Paul is mentioned by Polycarp. Later tradition has him linked to John, but Polycarp himself doesn't say so.
You have Ignatius, early part of the 2nd century.
Ignatius mentions preaching of Peter and Paul only.
Polycarp probably knew the Apostle John as well. You've got Clement of Rome, who mentions the sufferings, probably the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. So you do have some, not only New Testament sources that are in 1st century, but you have some early 2nd century sources like Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, and then you have some later 2nd century, and then some early 3rd century. So I wouldn't consider those to be too late. I mean, sure, the earlier the better, of course.
Right.
Early 2nd century is going to be plenty of sufficient there. But when you get to the latter part of the 2nd century, early part of the 3rd, not quite as good, but still not bad at all. It's when you get after that you start to see more of these detailed accounts of their martyrdoms. And they may be true, they may not be. We just don't know. But I think there's around a dozen sources that I've named are pretty decent.
Do those name apostles in general, or did they list off like Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thaddeus, Simon, Zealot, Matthias, that kind of thing?
Boy, I'd have to go back to Paulogia and look at it.
Okay. To be fair, I also had to go back and look each of those up.
Some of them, like, for example, you'll have Clement of Rome, very early that's the latter part of the 1st century, around the same time as John's gospel being written. In fact, an increasing number of scholars are placing it somewhere between the years 67 and 69. And I'm not sure which one I think. I probably go toward a little of the earlier ones because of some of the arguments that are given, one in particular, which I don't think has ever been answered adequately. But so you do have some also in the 1st century and early 2nd century. Clement of Rome does mention Peter and Paul. Some of the others mention individuals. A number of them mention Paul. But a lot of them also mention just how the disciples of Jesus suffered continuously for their gospel proclamation. But unfortunately, at this point, I'd have to look it up to see.
That's fair.
Which ones they actually do.
The reason this question is important is to demonstrate the evidential retreat of the Christian apologist when it comes to using martyred disciples to bolster Jesus' resurrection claims. The least sophisticated want to say that Jesus must have been risen because 12 disciples were eyewitnesses and died horrible deaths refusing to recant. This is nothing but a Christian urban myth that is not backed by evidence.
I think, as you point out, you and I have this in common. I think there's also been a hyper trust by many Christians who read martyrs and says, hey, they all died as martyrs, and they proclaim it. Well, I've made that claim in the past, so I repent on this show from making that before I did my research. That should be corrected as well.
With insufficient evidence to back actual martyrdoms, slightly more sophisticated apologists will water down their claim to 12 eyewitness disciples who were willing to suffer and die.
Pun intended, I don't want to die on the definition of martyr.
Right.
That's really not what's most important. Mm-hmm. The question is, did these guys really believe they had seen the risen Jesus? And do they put themselves in harm's way, willing to suffer and die for this proclamation?
Mike and the other apologists' demonstration that these 12 were willing to suffer and die is that they went out preaching. But where exactly is the evidence that these men went out preaching? Mike seems to affirm today that it's simply the same sources for the martyrdoms, which he admitted up front are not as solid for anyone other than Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus. And that's fine, but when it comes to James, son of Zebedee, Thomas, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, or Simon the Zealot, the evidence that they even went out preaching to put themselves in harm's way is pretty thin, at least by my estimation. Don't let the Christians hide behind general grouping words like apostles and disciples to present the idea that the message was a dozen strong from day one. Most of these guys disappear from reliable history. And in that same line of questioning, I had answered the caller speaking about the death of James, the brother of Jesus. And basically I was using the Josephus source, and I classified it in a way, it's basically as a political death. We're not saying that they died for truth at that point. They may well have died for pissing someone off, which actually in the case of Jesus's brother, that's exactly why he was killed, not for his beliefs, which I knew someone like you would probably take exception to that. And you kind of mentioned that I probably should have fleshed it out with the account from Hegesippus and from Clement.
That's entirely consistent. But that is not the only thing. That's just Josephus' story. Fuller accounts are found in Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria. According to those two, he died as a martyr. So just because Josephus doesn't mention the whole story doesn't mean that we should think that, we have no accounts of it.
I guess my question is, do you think that, since I don't take the Hegesippus and Clement accounts to be politically reliable, do you think that I was somewhat disingenuous if I'm sticking only to the Josephus source? Like, do you feel like in these conversations I really should be linking to both of them if I don't take them as good historical evidence?
Clement of Alexandria is not the most reliable source. So I can understand some hesitation there. Hegesippus, though, he's not that late. As far as I remember, and it's been a while since I've looked at this Paulogia, but Hegesippus, I think, is early 2nd century. So I don't know that I would discount that, because that would be very close to when Josephus reports, the execution of James, the brother of Jesus. So I think Josephus' report is probably going to be the best, just because it's an unsympathetic source and it's 1st century. Whereas, the others are going to be Christian sources. We don't know much about Hegesippus. Clement of Alexandria, again, he's not reliable at times. So, he's going to have lesser weight. But, yeah.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess my question had kind of been, do you think that I sort of interacting in these spaces, do you feel like I kind of have an obligation to bring up someone like Hegesippus if I don't necessarily think that they're a great source?
To be honest with you, I'd have to just see the context. And
okay,
the interview that you're referring to, I guess that was a year or so ago, and I don't remember much of it, to be honest with you. I do remember doing it, but I don't remember much of what was said in there. I don't mind if a person doesn't mention all the sources, but if a person, and I don't recall what you said, to be honest with you, but if you said, we only have Josephus, probably not what you said, but if you said we only have Josephus, that I'd probably hesitate over that.
That's totally fair. So on the call, I summarized what Mike and I agree is the earliest and most reliable source for the death of Jesus' brother James. I didn't mention later sources that I consider inaccurate legendary development, but I also didn't deny them. Let me know in the comments if you think I handled this information presentation well or not. In another conversation, I actually had a chance to offer you a question at an online stream, and I asked you about a hypothetical.
Consider a notion that Peter and Paul were the only actual eyewitnesses to the really risen Jesus. Our Gospels and creeds would then be legendary stories. Do other lines of evidence exist that contradict such a scenario?
And you focus largely on the Gospels, which is fair because, of course, the Gospels then at that point would have to be recording some legendary development that didn't actually occur.
If it was only Peter and Paul.
Right. I guess the question is, beyond the fact that the Gospels then would contain some legendary development, is there anything historically, do you think, that makes it impossible that there was only a handful of actual appearances and that maybe some of the other appearances, I guess the idea that some appearances really happened, but maybe some are embellished and largely legendary?
Okay, fair question. I look at the earliest tradition, at least earliest extant that we have that can date. I think that would be the oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8.
Right.
And that mentions 3 group appearances, 3 individual appearances, one to the skeptic Paul. So, the Gospels have group appearances. Of course, the oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15 is not attempting to narrate things. That's not the purpose. That's not it's a letter. It's not a biography. So do the Gospels, in terms of the appearances of Jesus, do they contain any legendary elements? Well, that's impossible to know, I think, of whether they do.
I guess I was wondering if you saw anything like in church history or do you think it's impossible timing wise that the legendary developments couldn't happen, or was there any other outside constraint that makes it, unplausible?
Yeah, I do think it's plausible that a legendary element could creep into it. I mean, in the Lucian of Samosata's treatment called Concerning the Passing of Peregrinus, he talks about the suicide of Peregrinus, where he builds a very large fire and it makes a big public spectacle of this, and he climbs up and then he leaps into it. And Lucian says that just a little bit later, he was passing by shortly after this happened, and he saw an old man who looked very wise, saying that he saw, if I remember right, an eagle fly out from the fire. He said he saw Peregrinus fly out. So, I mean, it's like this elderly man, according to Lucian, was making the thing up. Now, some have called that into question, whether Lucian was telling the truth there, because Lucian was a satirist who didn't care too much for Jesus.
Right.
He mentions Jesus' crucifixion in Palestine, and then he's talking about the passing of Peregrinus here. But either way, I think we recognize that an urban legend can pop up quite quickly. And some will quote the classicist A.N. Sherwin White and saying, that a generation is not enough time.
Right.
But he's not saying that it's not enough time for a legend to develop. He's saying it's not enough time for that legend to replace the historical core.
While Mike is technically correct here, the trouble with this often cited A.N. Sherwood White quote is not the distinction between legends and legends with a historical core. The problem is that in White's 1960 book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament, the classicist isn't drawing a conclusion from any sort of research. There was no literature review, no exhaustive comparative study. White described a single data point, 5th century Herodotus, and his description of the assassination of Hipparchus, and drew entirely arbitrary extrapolations and conclusions from it. With this kind of methodology, I could look at Barack Obama and extrapolate that every U.S. president has been of African descent. See my Case for Christmas Part 1 video for a full breakdown on this quote, but the short version is that no apologist should use it.
And so you still have the apostles that are out there for several decades who are proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus and appearances to individuals, to groups, to friend and foe alike. So whether the Gospels contain any legendary elements, whether they amplify the resurrection narratives, I think it's impossible to know whether any of those are in that sense. But I think the core of it is likely true, that on Sunday morning the women found an empty tomb, and that shortly afterward, his disciples and individuals and in group settings had experiences that they were convinced were the risen Jesus appearing to them.
You and I are on the same page there. I think it's impossible without at least a few people having something genuine happen. So Dr. Mike Licona agrees with me. There's nothing impossible about legendary development prior to the Gospels being written down, and that there's no way for a historian to differentiate which is which, potentially including group appearances for risen Jesus. I hope Dr. Loke catches that. In the final episode of your season 6 of your podcast, which if no one listens to your podcast, it has the best intro song of any podcast that exists. I love it. It makes me smile every time, so thank you for that. Kurt asked you about the possibility of Jesus ending up in a mass grave in that episode, but unfortunately the conversation kind of went all over and you never cycled back to that.
Oh, okay.
So I guess I wanted to ask you the same basic question.
What's sort of an alternative view to the empty tomb? Would it be something like the wrong tomb, a mass grave approach?
Well, let's say but if it was just, rather than a stone-cut tomb, he was put into an unmarked grave, does that kind of have some explanatory power for, for example, for people not being able to produce the body to refute claims, or not needing to have a stolen body or anything like that? Like, would it, and this is kind of what Kurt asked you, would a burial like that have any kind of explanatory power, do you think?
Let me approach it maybe just a little bit differently and then follow up with me. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've got some really good evidence that although it was the practice of the Romans throughout the empire to either leave the crucified victims on their crosses to be devoured by insects, birds of prey, and dogs later on, as well as removing them from their crosses and just putting them in a shallow pit, covering over with a little dirt and letting the dogs finish the corpse up. That was not the practice in Jerusalem. And we know this because you've got Josephus in his Jewish Wars, Book 4, Section 317. He talks about how the Idumeans, Jews who had been requested from some zealots who were imprisoned by the other more moderate Jews in Jerusalem at the time in the 60s, that they had appealed to the Idumean Jews to come down and help them. And the Idumeans came down and they freed the Jews and the zealots in prison, and then they killed a bunch of the more moderate Jews. And Josephus reports that the more moderate Jews were incensed because before that time, which is probably around 67, 68 AD, you've got, it says before that time, it was the custom of the Jews to remove the crucified and the condemned and to give them a burial prior to sunset. That would mean a proper burial, and to be just thrown into a common pit just would not have worked in that sense. So they're going to get a proper burial, not necessarily an honorable burial, but a proper burial. And then you've got the fact that you have Yehohanan from that was discovered in archaeological remains in the 1960s. I think 1967.
Right, the nail in the foot. Yep.
Yep. And then since then, this isn't widely known, but there have been several more remains of crucified victims discovered in ossuaries in Jerusalem. So, which means that you have, and these ossuaries were in effect from 30 BC to around the year 70 AD. It was a full century. So this would suggest that even those executed received proper burials, and they were put in tombs until their bodies decomposed, and then they would take the remains and put them in an ossuary and give that a final burial. So I don't see any evidence that they were given this dishonorable burial of being just thrown into a pit or left on their crosses like was common throughout the rest of the Roman Empire. So typically, most scholars now, the debate is not whether they were the crucified victims or Jesus might have been thrown into a pit for the dogs to eat them, like John Dominic Crossan would suggest. It is more along the lines of, when Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus, was it an honorable burial as the gospel accounts suggest, or just was it a plain old burial? Maybe even a dishonorable one that he's thrown into the tomb, but still put into a tomb nonetheless.
Unfortunately, we ran out of time for me to chat back on that one, but we will maybe reserve that for another day. For a full detailed treatment on all of these Jesus burial topics, see my 3 Christians Bury Paulogia on Jesus' burial video. Very briefly, in the 1st century, there was a superstitious practice of using crucifixion nails in the burial rituals of non-crucifixion victims. There's good evidence that any accommodations made for Jewish customs, if any at all, would not have extended to criminals who committed treason, which is the charge against Jesus put forth in the Gospels. And notations of exceptions solidify the general rule. Take all that for what it's worth, but Mike didn't engage in the hypothetical at all. Whether a non-stone tomb fate for Jesus' body would have explanatory power for so-called resurrection facts and apologetics. I contend that it would. Sadly, we ran out of time. I do have some other thoughts, but that's fine, because the thing we're most important about today, learning about this debate that you're having with Bart Ehrman, which I'm so excited about. And if you could just take a little bit of time and tell us why this debate is different than the other debates you've had, what's going to be cool about it?
Well, so Bart and I have had 6 previous debates, 2 on Justin Brierley's show. We've had, we've had another one, a written debate on the historical reliability of the Gospels. And then we've had 3 others. Let's see. We've had 2 on the resurrection of Jesus. So anyway, there's 6 so far. And then this is going to be our 7th. And what's different about this one is it's like an all-day event. So most debates will last about 2.5 hours, 2 to 2.5 hours. This one's going to be all day. So it's going to allow us more time to give our case. It's going to allow us more time to offer rebuttals to what our opponent has said, and give plenty of time for audience Q&A. So I think it's going to be just a real informative time that viewers who are really into this very important topic. I mean, it's important for Christian and non-Christian alike. For a Christian, if Christ rose, Christianity is almost certainly true. If Christ did not rise, Christianity is certainly false. And so this will be an all-day event. I'm looking forward to it. Bart's a good guy. We've become friends over the years. We have strong disagreements on this, and it'll probably be a spirited debate, but it'll be collegial. So I'm looking forward to it.
If you want to be ringside for this monster debate event, or to watch the replay over and over, you'll need to sign up. And you can do that at tinyurl.com/BartDebate, as seen on screen and in the description. And if you use that link, you'll be helping this channel, which is greatly appreciated. I can't wait for this, so you'll definitely be seeing me there.
I'll look forward to it, Paul.
Absolutely.
It's been a pleasant conversation with you.
For more interaction for and against the scholarship of Dr. Mike Licona, tap on the thumbnail on screen now for the Paulogia versus Licona playlist, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.